Hello, welcome. I'm Kate Mackay, Associate Film Curator here at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our live stream conversation and Q&A related to Sharon Shattuck and Ian Chaney's new documentary, Picture a Scientist. This event is part of our series, Picture a STEMinist, featuring documentaries and conversations about the experiences and contributions of women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. This series is co-presented with the Women in Tech Initiative at the University of California, and I would like to thank Jill Finlayson for inspiring the series and for helping to find support. We would also like to thank Citrus, 150 Years of Women at Berkeley, and the University of California Office of the President. I would also like to express our profound gratitude to our film series sponsors, Karen and Russell Merritt, for their generous support of these programs. The Picture a STEMinist programs are available free of charge to students at UC Berkeley, UC Davis, UC Merced, and UC Santa Cruz. And BAM-PFA is very happy to be able to reach students beyond the borders of Berkeley. I hope that you've all had a chance to view Picture a Scientist, which chronicles the experiences and challenges faced by several generations of women and asks what is lost to science when contributions of at least half the population are discouraged. But if you haven't had a chance, it's still available for a few more hours, and then it becomes unavailable after midnight tonight. So I hope you take it in. Today, we have an amazing group of scientists here with us to discuss the issues explored in the film. And we'll have about 40 minutes of conversation, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So please enter your questions using the Q&A function of the webinar at any point, and we'll get to them closer to the end of the program. It is now my great pleasure and really an honor to introduce our amazing guests today. Nancy Hopkins, who's featured in Picture a Scientist, is a molecular biologist and Amgen Professor of Biology Emerita at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She is known for her research identifying the role genes play in longevity and cancer predisposition in adult fish, as well as for her work promoting equality of opportunity for women scientists in academia. She is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Mahzarin Banaji is the Richard Clarke Cabot Professor of Social Ethics in the Department of Psychology at the Harvard University and a 2018 inductee into the National Academy of Sciences. She is the co-author of Blind Spot, Hidden Biases of Good People, and the co-founder of Project Implicit, an organization aimed at educating the public on implicit bias. And she's also featured in Picture a Scientist, and her research is fascinating. Dr. Katya Cherukumilli holds a PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering from UC Berkeley and is founder and CEO of Global Water Labs, a nonprofit organization offering technical expertise to water providers in impoverished, resource-constrained regions. Her overarching research interests and passions are focused on advancing equitable access to safe drinking water through the lens of technological innovation, global health, and environmental sustainability. Dr. Asmeret Asefaw Berhe is the Professor and Falasco Chair of Earth Sciences, Life and Environmental Science Department at UC Merced. She's a soil scientist working on natural climate change solutions, an advocate for equity and inclusion in STEM. And her research is broadly focused on soil science and global change science. The main goal of her research is to understand the effect of changing environmental conditions on vital soil processes. And this fascinates me. My sister is a farmer and a gardener, and so soil is dear to my heart. And finally, I would like to turn things over to our moderator today. Yonna Kim is joining us from South Korea, and she's a fourth-year undergraduate student majoring in physics at UC Berkeley and is part of the STEMinist Chronicles, a student organization group dedicated to highlighting the stories of women in STEM. So there's no better moderator. And I'll turn it over to Yonna now. Thanks very much and welcome, everybody.
Thank you so much, Kate, for the introductions. And I'd like to start off the conversation with just a broad question regarding the film itself. Diving into the testimonies of the 3 different women featured in the film, how are they representative of the explicit and implicit discrimination and harassment that women face in STEM today, coming from your own personal experiences and also from the experiences you've heard from other women in the field?
I can share my perspective to start off. So one of the things that I really walked away with after watching the film was something that Dr. Rachel Burks, a chemistry professor at American University, said, which was that over time as a woman, and from her perspective as a woman of color, you get used to being underestimated and treated poorly and without respect. And you get so used to being invisible, but then on the other side, you're also hyper visible because people are wondering, why are you here? She gave some examples of, you know, being in her office or parking in a faculty parking garage, and people constantly questioning and invalidating her ability to be there as a faculty member. And so I found that to be a really powerful message. And something that you asked about, which is how are some of these harassment and discrimination practices still going on today? Well, you know, I recently finished my PhD in 2017 and then a postdoctoral fellowship this year. And I've gotten comments saying things like, you know, in your academic job search, you'll definitely get that position because of the diversity angle. Or you're really good at communication and storytelling, so I see you as a CEO or in a leadership and management position, but not so much as an academic researcher or scientist. And to both of these types of comments, my response would be, no, you know, if I get a job, it's because I'm qualified, I'm passionate, and I've been actually training for this moment for the past 2 decades. I have good research ideas and the motivation to see them through. And that's why I'll get the job. I'm competitive too, and I put my blood, sweat, and tears into everything I do. And just because scientists and women in particular develop very good communication skills or can capture an audience with storytelling, that does not mean that you don't belong in academia as a scientist or a researcher. In fact, I think that makes you a better mentor to inspire students and overall a better collaborator and so on. So those are some of my thoughts.
Thank you for sharing.
Well, I would say that watching the movie, I must say I was shocked by the Jane story myself. And I like to think that something like that is very rare in academia. I don't know the data. I'm sure it's in the National Academy report. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I think if you think about that iceberg image that they used, which I thought was so effective about these issues that women face, those ones that we see and hear about are these very shocking stories of sexual harassment or assault almost that seem to happen. But they're kind of the tip of the iceberg. But I think what Katya was just talking about these more subtle things, whether you're being mistaken for, you know, how could that person be a professor? So you're being, or whatever, you're mistaken for somebody else. Those are the more common ones. And of course, the ones that really matter, I think, and maybe Mahzarin will talk about this, are the ones that you kind of don't know about. When I was young, I thought it was so rare to have a woman professor that people just assumed you were your secretary or you were your technician. I mean, that was just automatic. I didn't think it mattered. I thought the only thing that mattered was doing a great experiment. And once you did that, everybody would say, oh boy, she's terrific and everything's going to be fine. So none of it mattered. None of these little things really mattered. And that was the slow realization I had, that those things were signaling actually a lot more that was going on that was invisible. And that it took me 20 years to figure out, which I didn't know, the kind of research people like Mahzarin were capable of doing, that really these things were associated with an undervaluation of people. They weren't just these trivial little things at all. They were reflecting valuations and judgments that were serious, that could affect people's careers. So I think that's the big part of the iceberg that we grapple with, really.
I would add that I think one of the things that stood out for me and things that I've come to appreciate even more over the last few years is how common these issues of harassment and discrimination are in academic and STEM workplaces. I was shocked to find out that in terms of the amount of sheer volume of harassment and discrimination that happens in workplaces, academia is only next to the military. There's only one other type of professional space that's worse from these kinds of experiences, and that's shocking. And to just kind of build on something both Katya and Nancy talked about, that story with Rachel Burke obviously resonated with me as a Black woman in STEM. I feel like she was telling my story half the time, obviously, as you can imagine, right? But more importantly, I think what a lot of people don't appreciate is this dichotomous thing that happens when you're a member of a minoritized group in STEM, right? For being woman and a member of an underserved community, you're constantly being told on one side, you're not good enough, you don't belong in this space. And then on the other side, everybody wants your attention when they need help with this other issue, or somehow they think of you like this unique unicorn that made it out of this community that doesn't typically produce people like that, right? And it's a very kind of weird thing that is hard to reconcile in your head, right? You can't possibly be any extreme on either side. You're just who you are, and you carry your work, and you do, you carry on with your life with all your flaws and everything else. But this dichotomous treatment that you get in STEM workplaces in particular, though, is pretty interesting. And yeah, well, maybe we'll talk about some of the history of why STEM is like that in the coming questions. I'll let Yonna proceed with her questions. And
yeah, I would also like to ask Dr. Mahzarin Banaji regarding what Dr. Hopkins brought about implicit biases, and how often in the film we talked about the iceberg, and how I think most people assume when they think about harassment and discrimination, they think about that top percent. They think about kind of really explicit moves that people make on women, or the more extreme actions that happen. But oftentimes it's really more of that bottom 90-95% that really affect women in the day-to-day in the field. And I was wondering if she could comment on that. Yeah.
Sure. So that iceberg is a wonderful metaphor. We can use it in so many ways. When you look at the law and you look at the number of cases that you start with on something like harassment, and then the number of those people who might report the case, and then of the ones who report the case, the ones who choose to do something a little more public. And by the time, and my colleague Linda Krieger just shows that you can start with thousands, and for every thousands and thousands of them, there might be one case that eventually actually goes forward. This is not even talking about who wins or who loses. It's just even going forward. So we should know that those are the numbers. And in that sense, I think the film, by picking the examples that it did, I think did a pretty good job of going into the field and pulling out two examples. I can tell you stories that are far, far worse. I can tell you stories that are more moderate, but they are all of a piece. And your question to me, and I just want to say this because it's been asked of me so much, and especially in these last 3.5 years, what are we doing talking about implicit bias when what we're seeing out there is just clear, explicit bias, right? So the people who think about implicit bias have never doubted the presence of explicit bias. Of course, we know that it's there. As a psychologist, I've always found people who are explicitly biased to be completely uninteresting as objects of study, because they just, they tell you we dislike people of a certain group, and then they behave in that way. What's interesting about that? What's interesting to me is the fact that many of us may not even think that we are carriers of these very same ideas in our own heads. Okay, that and yet our espoused values are not at all in line with the way in which we might behave. Right? And so this is why our focus is on this, because when you want to look at the underbelly of that iceberg, what I want to point out is that you could take a single instance in the movie and say, well, maybe that would not have exactly happened to somebody. But that's where I am here to bear witness to thousands and thousands of people's data from their heads and into a computer and into our database and then back into the journals, where we can tell you that this is not an isolated problem, that this is everywhere. There's a new paper that we have coming out. I have not spoken of it anywhere, so I'll tell it to you.
Okay.
If you take women and men in science and you show people images of men and women in science, and you try to get people to associate those men and women dressed in lab coats and goggles and so on to words like science versus sex, meaning love and kissing and intercourse and so on, men and women will associate women scientists much more with sex than with science. Okay, and for men they can be either. Right? So this paper is going to come out, but it took us the longest time. It got rejected from 20 different places because nobody wanted to publish this result. I don't know what it's going to say when it appears, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. It's the only time I've gotten two pieces of pretty deep hate mail from two scientists because we decided not to just measure the average person in the population. We wanted to measure professors of science at R1 science institutions in the country. So many of your UC schools, my school, Nancy's school, these are the places from which we are measuring faculty and what is in their head when they think about a woman scientist. And apparently it's sex.
That's wow, yeah, that's very shocking. Do any of the other panelists like to comment on that, specifically regarding the 90% of the iceberg and also kind of facing our own internal implicit biases? And I think that's one of the most uncomfortable facts about implicit bias, is that it's not just this kind of image of some angry man who's sort of pointing fingers at women. It's within all of us. So would anyone like to comment on that?
I'm shocked. I'm shocked, Mahzarin, by your result. I'm not so surprised it was rejected. I'm a little disheartened about the hate mail, but I don't know. It's funny because I was communicating with a woman scientist this week, and enormous stature and so forth. And she said, I think that I'm never, ever just seen as a scientist. I'm always seen as a woman scientist. And I thought, what an interesting remark. Mm-hmm. And I think that might be along the lines you're saying. You know, we all, I think, we just want to be a scientist.
Yeah.
That's all. We just want to be a scientist. We don't want to think about this issue when we're working. I don't. I mean, I'm just thinking about science. So when she said that, it really brought me up short. This person can't achieve high level. There's no more levels to achieve, you know, and yet it's a woman. So, I mean, can you explain it to us more, the result, Mahzarin? I mean, I really am kind of stunned by it, and yet.
You mean the result that I just reported, or
yes.
the lady doctor problem? Yeah. That's good.
The result and what you think about it, and yeah. Why you think it's that way. I mean,
I think that if you think historically, and if you think about what the category scientist means, a cerebral person, a person for whom their mind, it's not just a scientist, it's anybody who's an intellectual, a person who is an academic, somebody for whom their mind is their vehicle of operating in the world. Okay, if for millennia it has not been anybody but one kind of person, how is this poor brain to quickly figure out that it can be everybody, right? So in one sense, we want to cut people some slack. But then with gender, unlike with race and so on, you have the additional problem that women have an entire different identity, that of giving birth to babies and taking care of them. And that identity is not just neutral, it is seen as oppositional to this one. Every neuron you spend thinking about your child, you're taking away from your science, is the assumption, right? And so I see where it's coming from. And maybe before I make you all really miserable with all my data, I will also tell you the good news. So there are two tests. One, the gender science test, in which we show that men and women associate male with career and female with home. And then there is the science test, right? Which is that we see that male is science. And by contrast, we will give women the arts. We will say that by comparison, they can have the arts, but not science, right? Those two tests have been running now on the website since 1998. We have clean data from about 10 years. And a brilliant student, Tessa Charlesworth, has been analyzing these data using time series analyses to look at, are we changing over time? Are Americans changing, not in what they say on a survey, but on these measures of implicit bias? Has the thumbprint of the culture on all of our brains loosened up at all? And the good news is, yes, it has. So today, more so than 10 and 15 years ago, this bias has dropped off. We are not as rigid in our assumption that female is home and male is career, female is arts and male is science. It has come down by about 15%. The one problem here is that this bias on science is dropping off in women, but not so much in men. So the drop is almost 20% for women, but usually men and women change at about equal rates. In almost every test, they tend to be together going, if they go down, they both go down, they go down at equal rates. But on the gender science test, women are changing much faster than men in reaching neutrality, in their belief that men and women can equally belong in science. I should stop there and let you all say something about it.
Wow.
I'd like to take it a step back a little and talk about what you mentioned about how there's such a strong, rigid image of what a scientist is, or at least it's slowly changing, but there's still a pretty strong image of what a scientist is or who a scientist is. And this is also related to a question from somebody in the audience. How do you think the environment and structure of academia allows for harassment, but also the propagation of this kind of rigid image of a scientist? And what ways can we mitigate it in the future? And I'd like to start this conversation with Dr. Cherukumilli.
Sure. So to respond to the question about how the academic environment itself allows for harassment just through the institution or structure, I would say that, especially in graduate school, whether you're a master's student or a PhD student, and in fact, even afterwards when you're a postdoc, there's a very hierarchical structure of where you belong in the academic hierarchy and where your mentor is. And you have to maintain a certain level of professionality and cordiality in order to eventually succeed after you finish your studies or work. And oftentimes this leaves very little room for graduate students and postdocs to complain about, things like bad behavior or mistreatment. And it's quite challenging to address this, honestly, because of the way that, universities function. And I would say one way to mitigate this over time is to perhaps allow students to have a more diverse committee of advisors that they can go to and sort of not just rely on one individual advisor or professor, but really allow them to pick different people that have their best interest at heart. And this way, when there are tough situations they have to deal with, they'll have a support system. I'm curious to hear what the other professors on this panel think about this as well.
Would Dr. Asmeret Asefaw Berhe, would you like to talk?
Sure. Yeah, I'll add to what Katya just said. I think she is 100% right in highlighting that these archaic hierarchical system of training that we have in academic institutions, it's this master apprentice type of model, right? Where the master controls all the resources, makes all the decisions, and basically has the fate of the trainee in their hand, is extremely damaging, and it's partly what makes academic institutions very ripe for this kind of harassment. But we also have to acknowledge the fact that part of the history of the academic institutions that we're all part of is that they're built with a culture of exclusion in mind. The exclusion is not a side effect, it was part of the design, right? The institutions were not made for everybody, and that's a really important thing to remember. And then we've gotten into a habit in academic institutions, I think, of letting people get away with harassment and discrimination because we believe, I think, way too much in this cult of a celebrity scientist, especially as soon as they achieve some notoriety, that the university they become untouchable, right? Because if you look at the data of who are the people doing all this harassment, and over time, you quickly start noticing that a lot of the people that are accused of harassment are serial harassers. They do it over and over and over again. So whenever those cases do come up, those cases that are near the top of that iceberg that Ms. Rani and others talked about, when these cases do come into public attention, it's with multiple cases that have already been brought forward to the university, but the university didn't deal with them. So indeed, I think an important part of addressing this problem going forward is thinking about the culture and climate in academic institutions, and also how we're mentoring students, as Katya said, and the mentoring structures that have become the norm. And I think dismantling those and thinking of a structure that empowers the mentee to seek out a community of mentors that support them is an important way forward. But I think at some point we also have to think about a bit more radical steps, right? In academic institutions, we are very, let's just say, strict about how we handle people who mishandle data or text. People who plagiarize are persona non grata from our communities, right? People who fabricate data also get kicked out of our communities. But we don't have the same standards for people who mistreat the people that generate the text and the data. And so as some professional societies have started right now, I think we need to get serious about getting harassment and discrimination to be, as they should be considered, research misconduct.
Those are some really good points. Dr. Hopkins, would you like to add or comment?
Yeah, but I think the comments that are made, I totally agree with. I think that to the extent you can, there's two things I would say. One of them is, yes, how do you prevent this kind of hierarchy and this single person having power? I think what Katya said, I agree totally. I think that system might have worked in the old days before the university became so diverse. When women came in, a lot of structures that had worked fine before just didn't work anymore. So the whole mentoring system was not straightforward and simple. The committees, the having just one advisor instead of having a group of advisors. So these were solutions, to have a committee to oversee the PhD students. So there, if some problem came up, there wasn't just one person who knew what was going on who could make the decision, but a whole group of people were overseeing it. That was a huge thing. It was really a big deal. And similarly for mentoring, for young faculty, when they come, they used to just be kind of mentored just by naturally. But I think, again, when more diverse faculty arose, then you needed a system. So they had assigned mentors so that junior faculty would, they were certain they were being taken care of along the way. And they'd have assigned mentors and so forth, or chose their mentors. So you can get by some of these problems by looking at your system and seeing if you can change the system. But I think that, and in terms of inequities, which is the thing that I had dealt with when I was doing this work back many years ago, a comment was made by the president of MIT, which I cherish. I thought he summed it right up. At the time, we were talking about the marginalization of women, how they get left out of important professional activities, which is a tremendous problem, obviously. And we called it marginalization. And he said, Nancy, anything I can measure, I can fix, and I will, but I don't know how to fix marginalization. And over years of watching this, I saw MIT do exactly what he said. I'm going to fix this. And he did. So you can fix your hiring process. You can redesign your hiring process. You can review all the applications that come in, you go searches and whether they really reflect the pool of talent that's out there. And then you can adjust accordingly. But the hard one at the end of the day is this one of individual interactions that so much of professional work is about. You know, who do you actually collaborate with? Who do you write that grant with? Who do you found that company with? Those personal interactions, those you can't really monitor. And in a way, I think that's kind of where we're stuck, I think. But I want to hear what others think about that. But as I think, yes, to the extent you can change the institutional processes so they can address these things. And another one, of course, was at the time I came into the system, which thank heavens has changed for you young people. You know, women had children, hello, and this was not acknowledged as a fact of life, okay? So, and the women who came in were afraid to talk about it because it was so clearly they were entering a system where a man had a wife at home and an assistant who took care of him in the office and he was taken care of. Women did not have that, okay? So the whole having to have daycare on campus and family leave policies. We had family leave policies when I was young, but only men took them. Women were afraid to take them because it would look as if they weren't serious. So that had to be addressed. That was a major component of a system which had been designed for a different person, literally. It had to be redone. So I think we're still in the process myself of redesigning the that system of the family work so that it's natural to see babies on campus. When I first saw babies on campus and it was just monumental. I couldn't believe I was saying baby. There's a baby, a professor pushing a baby carriage. It was really a major event in my life. You know, so these things can change, but they take real attention to do it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Can I quickly add one more thing that I think, first of all, there's so much gold here. We could talk about just the last 3 minutes for the next hour. But I think Professor Berhe, is that how you say your name, Berhe? Correct. Okay. All right. So I think what she said, when I didn't know this, when you said that harassment is greatest in academia after the military. And so I just want to go back and say, I've always said academia is like the military. On the one hand, we have this image that we're the opposite of the military. I think I have really seriously became an academic because I didn't want to wear a uniform. You know, I didn't want to go to work in high heels and a business suit. And I thought, where can I do that? And academia seemed like a decent place to be able to wear flat, comfortable shoes and so on. And so but I do believe that our structures are incredibly hierarchical and where there's very little latitude for any deviation. You know, you can't just take 5 years off, do something else, and then say, okay, I want to go get a PhD or take. It's a very rigid system. And it's also a system that, like the priesthood or something, is internally monitored, where we say, you can't tell us what to do. You can't tell me how to teach my course. And I love that about being an academic, that I can't be told how to do it because only I know how to do this work with my lab and with my students. But it leaves us at risk for many things that are actually quite rotten in the center of academia that has to be outed. And we need to speak about these. I think this film helps us to do that. And yet I think we should be able to have all those wonderful freedoms that academia gives us without being so closed that nothing can monitor our own behavior. Yeah.
Yep. No, I think you're right. Just to kind of build on that, just to for those people who might not know the statistics on this. So about 62% of higher ed employees typically report witnessing or experiencing bullying, even the past 18 months before when they were surveyed. Overall, in the American workplace, 50% of people report experiencing harassment or directly witnessing harassment in front of them. But in academia, that number is 90%. So almost everybody in academic institutions has either experienced harassment at least once or has directly been witness to harassment. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the numbers are extremely shocking, right? And I think you said it exactly, Marjane, that the hierarchy and this independence that we value in academic institutions is partly why there are these barriers to monitoring when things do not work the way they should. And we also haven't had a system that's had accountability built into it, right? There's very little accountability mechanism in the academic system when somebody does indeed harass or discriminate folks and mistreat individuals they're supposed to be working with.
To quickly add on to that point about accountability, one thing that I was thinking about as something that we could change in academia moving forward is quite similar to how professors or lecturers who are teaching a course have to get course evaluations at the end of the quarter or semester to get feedback on their performance. I've seen some examples of labs, which are lucky enough to have a lab manager, that distribute anonymous surveys. And of course, this works if your lab is above a certain critical size of members. And they kind of respond to questions about the lab culture and mentorship and how they're kind of surviving or thriving in the lab culture. And then the lab manager kind of compiles all these responses and is in charge of communicating them to the PI. And I feel like this is a really interesting model that could be tested to see if there's a more sensitive way to give feedback without having to deal with these individual interactions.
I think these are all really good points, and I think there's a couple live questions that are lined up here, so I'd like to go over them. So first, we have a question from Dale Wadman, who says, "It would never occur to my elementary school age sons that a woman or a person of color would be considered any less of a scientist than a white man. Am I naive in thinking that things could be equitable within a generation, or is bias something that is likely to get drilled into them as they get older?" And I think Dr. Banaji might have something to say for this.
Oh my God, I have a lot to say about that. First of all, I would say it's really worth a test, okay? And I'll tell you what that is when you go home with your elementary school sons, it would be interesting to do something that is an actual test. That is to say, to show them two individuals and have them predict which one is more likely to be X or Y. And you can pick with something like, you know, nurse and doctor, scientist, artist, just pick a bunch of things and just show them. You'll be surprised at how much they already are creatures of their culture. So we started to measure bias in about 5-year-olds, implicit bias, and it popped out at the level of what it was in the adults of their group. So if they're white kids, they look like white adults. That is to say, they show in-group preference. If you're white, you show preference for white. If you're African-American in this country, if you're Black, you don't necessarily show preference for Black over white. You're kind of neutral. You show equal preference. Half the African-Americans who take our test will show Black preference. The other half will show white preference. And Black kids look like that. So even by the age of 5, a Black kid has learned that this group, I may be good, but my group, who knows? It's hard for me to know. And so they've learned that. And I'll give you one quick example from my colleague who's a mathematician who just told me this story about her 4-year-old. Her 4-year-old, a year ago, she said, looked at a picture of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and said, "Who is that?" And her mother, my colleague, explained that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a Supreme Court justice and blah, blah, blah. And this 3-year-old said to her, "There is no way she can be a judge." Okay. Now, this 3-year-old has no knowledge of anything, what judge means or any of the words means, but was compelled enough, was confident enough to say, "No way, she can be whatever you're telling me. This person is very important. That person cannot be that." So I would urge you to think about whether we're even asking our elementary school kids the right questions to see what is in their heads, because every time we've looked, it looks like they have already picked this up in the culture. And of course they were not born with it, right? So they didn't know it, but the machine to learn rapidly and to place value, this is worthwhile, this is less worthwhile. Daddy is strong and big and smart. Mommy is nice and warm and smells good. These are not things you have to teach. They're going to be learned extremely fast and then generalized to the world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. There is another question from Breezy Jackson who asks, I'm curious about internalized bias or imposter syndrome and strategies that the panelists have developed to remain confident. And I'd like to start this conversation with Dr. Cherukumilli.
Sure, that's a great question. I'll respond to the bit about imposter syndrome. So I think one of the best strategies is to realize that everybody around you suffers from imposter syndrome. The most confident person that's externally projecting confidence and the shyest person with the most self-doubt. It's always there in academia. And I really doubt it when somebody says, you know, I don't have imposter syndrome. And so using that as a starting point, that's kind of leveling the playfield in terms of what you perceive of other people's success or progress and how you judge yourself. Once I was told that oftentimes, actually in preparation for my qualifying exam, my PhD advisor told me, you know, you are going to be your harshest critic. So make sure you recognize that when you enter the room, that you are always your harshest critic. And that was really a powerful lesson for me, because then it made me less worried about what other people thought. And I started judging myself and my thoughts and actions less. So I think another quick strategy about how to develop confidence and try to overcome this imposter syndrome is to get role models and mentors who are really actively looking out for you and who have gone through similar life experiences. So if you find someone aspirational, reach out to them, talk to them, ask them how they got where they are. And I promise you, through those stories, you'll learn that they too had some struggles or had to overcome some hurdles. So hopefully that advice helps a little bit.
Thank you. Would Dr. Berhe like to add on to that?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Katya said. And I think the only thing I would add in terms of internalized bias and imposter syndrome is, in fact, it's very helpful to know that not just us, but everybody around us has some form of bias that they've internalized, right? And they worry about, you know, judging one group or another harshly based on those biases. And I feel like after a while, I got to a point where I found comfort in that knowledge, because that means I can learn to, learn to make sure that I keep those biases in check, and also learn to recognize the things that, you know, get my imposter syndrome to flare up, and as much as possible deal with them ahead of time, or at least learn to weather through that situation, right? Maybe not thrive, but at least survive it well. And I think that's kind of what I have found helpful. And it's been incredibly powerful for me to learn that, you know, not just everybody suffers from imposter syndrome, but even the people who it becomes debilitating to sometimes are some of the most successful people who just are judging themselves harshly, and they're expecting a lot out of themselves. And I think if there is any one group of people who is harsh in judging themselves and their community, it's obviously academia. We're constantly trying in this competitive environment, right? And so, yeah, I think that's about the only thing I would say is, to me personally, it's been incredibly helpful to learn more about how this manifests and the experiences of people who I admire, with learning to keep the biases in check and even address their biases intentionally, right? If there's one thing we know we can do in this job, we can learn, right? So keep those biases in check and learn about how to deal with them in a helpful way, and have this conversation as much as possible with mentees. And yeah, I think that's all probably enough.
Thank you. Dr. Hopkins, do you have anything else to add to the answers already said? Oh, I think you're muted.
Thank you. I don't know enough about this question. I can tell you only anecdote. Maybe Mahzarin knows more. I often hear people say that people who teach a lot of students, that their female students lack confidence, that, and I hear this quite often. Now, I just don't know what the data is and whether it's really confirmed by a lot of data and where it comes from. And, it's concerned me a lot in science. So I hear people say, students come up to me and here's this boy comes up and he thinks he's got the subject aced, and really he's not doing that well in the class. And the girl comes up and says, I think I'm not doing that well. And she's doing very well, much better. So I hear this a lot. How true it is and what the data say, I don't really know. But of course it's concerning because, again, anecdotally, I have heard people say, well, I thought of one student who said to me, I was finishing my undergraduate thesis and somebody said to me, and my advisor said to me, well, so where are you going to graduate school? Where are you applying to graduate school? And she said, me? Who, me? I didn't know that I was good enough for graduate school. He forgot to tell her, this sort of thing. So that kind of thing, are people getting the encouragement that they should be getting? Again, if we have these biases, are we encouraging the people equally all the way along? And I don't know the answer to these questions, so I have to turn it over to the expert there.
So there are very few things on which there are actually solid gender differences. Okay, men and women are in many ways more similar to each other than we might even think, and it's really important to report on that. And Eleanor Maccabee, many years ago, wrote a book on every possible gender difference in babies all the way to toddlers. There are some, but they're very few, in certain kinds of aggression and so on, but not in most of the things. So given that, it turns out that the confidence issue that Nancy raises is a consistent difference, okay? And I don't know how exactly it maps onto the imposter thing, but I don't see, when I was chair of my department and I had to look at all the junior faculty, each one, I didn't see all the junior faculty equally feeling like imposters. There were ones who would come and just, put their CV on my desk and say, I think I should come up early for promotion. I don't think that person was experiencing imposter syndrome. And so I don't want to say that it is in everybody. It is experienced differently. Some people have belonged in the academy for many generations. And so why would they feel like imposters when people like them have been there before? And of course, others should feel like imposters, because an imposter means you feel there are not others like you. You're in a place where you don't belong. So yes, I do think that the confidence issue is how it's best measured. And two journalists actually wrote a wonderful book on this. They took all the data from the experimental social sciences and put it all together. It's called the Confidence Code. And it is about this. And the studies are I think they're stunning. And one of them is very similar to the one Nancy said. So you give people problems to solve. And you say, based on the problems you've just solved, do you think you would be right for this job? And you do see this pattern, this gender difference, so that if men get 6 out of 10 right, they say, I got 6 out of 10 right. I'm obviously, I can do this job. And women who get 8 out of 10 right say, but I didn't get the 2 right, so I'm not sure I'm good enough for this job. I can also tell you that during my years as chair, I once discovered that there were 4 amazing candidates in the field who did not apply for our job. And so I called them up and I said, why didn't you apply for our job? What's so wrong with us? And in academia, we apply for any job that is remotely in our field. And every one of them said the same thing. Well, all 4 were women. Their names were given to us when we wrote a letter and said, who are the people doing the most creative, interesting work in this field? And they were not in our pool. And when I asked them, they said exactly the same thing. All of the 4 women said, well, I just didn't feel I belonged at Harvard. And one of them even said, your advertisement said something like seeking exceptional researchers, exceptional teachers, exceptional humans. And I just don't think of myself that way. And so I didn't apply. And so, of course, there are 2 ways to think when this happens. One is, and I'm quite sure some of my colleagues, when I told this story, were thinking that, well, maybe they don't belong here. If they don't feel that they should be here, maybe they should not be here. But the rest of us, I think exactly the opposite, because none of us would be here if we had, been allowed to sort of just wander away. I didn't even apply for the first job I ever got, which was at Yale. My spouse had mailed in my CV. I had said, no way I'll get a job at Yale because I'm from a big state school, so why would they want to hire me? And so I applied to every other place, but not to Yale. And then Yale called me up and said, we have your CV, but no materials. Did you intend to apply? And I said to him, you rascal, did you mail my CV? And he said, yeah. He was in New York, I was in Seattle. He said, don't you want to live together? Yale would allow us to live together. And so as I say to my students, you don't want to wait for a feminist husband to mail in your CV. That is no longer an option. You have to mail it, let them reject you, but you cannot not mail it. And so the women have to know that in this way, maybe the men have it right. Maybe when they put themselves forward, if they're not doing it illegally, then I would say, maybe what they're doing is right. They're saying, look, here I am, I've worked hard, here's my CV. I think we might want to consider some similar action.
Thank you so much for the anecdote. We got 2 questions and they're both pretty similar, so I kind of want to group them together. The first one is from Vandana Ramakrishnan, and she says, given the data that there is a difference in the perception of female scientists between men and women, how do we include other groups of people in this kind of conversation to create allies? And then we also have another question from PH, who says, how can we bring in more allies and start a more institutional change rather than relying solely on volunteer work from people who care? And I'd like to start the conversation with Dr. Berhe.
Thanks. Yeah, so these are really good questions. So like the person who asked the question about institutional change and asked, I think there are a couple of things that I would note here. One is, obviously, we need to figure out ways where we can properly reward invisible labor that women and other folks who are underserved in the community are doing to address the issue that they did not create, right? We did not create exclusion, but somehow we're tasked with solving it. And that's a very huge burden. So obviously there has to be an institutional system for that. The other way is, I think, this came up a little bit when we were talking about the iceberg model in the National Academy's report, where there's a lot of harassment happening that doesn't kind of rise to the public perception or knowledge, all that stuff that's below the water level on the iceberg, basically, all the put downs and come ons that happen that undermine people. And part of the reason to figure this out is that it's not just undermining their career potential and progression, right? It's also undermining their health. And part of addressing the big egregious issues of harassment is recognizing that even the smaller, relatively smaller issues, the verbal harassment, for example, that doesn't rise up to the level of physical assault, all of that is underlaid by similar power dynamics. And unless we address those power dynamics at the institutional level, we can't really proceed. And right now, the only mechanism we have in institutions are things like Title IX. And forgive me for being a little too blunt here, but Title IX more often serves as a PR arm of the institution than actually addressing issues of harassment that serve the victims in any meaningful way. So we need a different model, but that different model should not just rely on legal basis, in my opinion. It also should rely to some extent on changing cultures and climates in academic institutions to make sure that all of us are on the same page about the kind of behaviors that are not acceptable. Right, the kind of treatment of if people in our community that we should not tolerate. And part of that to me is, getting people on board with what some folks refer to as bystander intervention. This is something very common in groups, for example, that address street harassment and other forms of harassment. And my colleagues and I are part of a large NSF-funded effort called the Advanced Geo Project, where we're trying to empower geoscientists to transform workplace behavior. And one of the biggest things that we've been working on are training our colleagues with bystander intervention approaches that most of us in academic institutions have never even heard of what those are, right? It's basically to recognize that there are many ways that we can intervene if we see harassment, if we experience harassment, and how we can seek support for the victims, as well as to also document and report cases of harassment openly or anonymously, whatever makes us comfortable based on the harassment. But what this bystander intervention approach does is recognize that there is no such thing as a neutral bystander, right? If I see harassment, I need to do something about it, even if what I can do about it is checking in on the victim afterwards, making sure that they're okay, and helping them document it in the form of a text message that I sent to them or something, right? Something to make sure that there is a support for the victims. There is an awareness of how prevalent these problems are becoming, and also support for the folks that are experiencing, because we don't want them to go on wondering whether they did anything to cause it on themselves. And so you need a whole lot of allies to do that, right? In fact, we need all of us to be on board with these kinds of approach for it to work. So there's a room for a lot of people who are not women, who are not members of underserved communities, to band together, to make purposeful efforts, right, to change the culture and climate in our institutions. And I think being an active bystander that doesn't pretend like we're neutral when we're seeing when we're seeing harassment and other forms of discrimination occur in front of us in our institutions, or when they're reported to us, is an important step in that direction.
Thank you very much. Dr. Hopkins, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I thought that was very important, and I agree completely. I think the difficulty comes in the execution, in the actual doing of it. I was reminded as you were speaking, Asmeret, about a case that somebody had brought to my attention recently, where some students were upset to discover that one of their colleagues held a set of beliefs that, of course, are not the kind of thing you want to think the person at the next bench is thinking about things. And I don't know the details, but some of these things, the questions are, is that harassment? Is that fair? Where's the line? And these are not trivial issues in many, many cases. And one of the problems, I think, is the hardest one for me, I think, has been after you have come to understand about unconscious bias and implicit bias and Mahzarin's kind of work, is that you may be alone in understanding about this. Your colleagues may not be on the same page with you. And they really have no idea what you're talking about. They don't see it that way. They don't see these things as a problem. And how you take that up with your colleagues that you work with every day and make something happen is not a trivial undertaking. And so unless the people, as you say, maybe in the majority group take it on, and or unless the administration, the person at the top says, we're going to diversify this and we have to make an environment in which everybody is comfortable. How do we do that? Now I'm going to judge you. I'm going to judge you. If you're the chair of the department, I'm going to judge you on how successful you are at doing that. So, you could do something like that. But when it comes to the actual cases, they're not trivial. They're not simple often. People have different views, different understandings of them. And this is where we are, I think, as a culture. I mean, I think trying to discuss these issues in a workplace can be very difficult, my experience.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly to Nancy's statement. She's correct in that these are non-trivial issues to identify. Many of us don't know where the boundaries are for when something crosses the line and becomes harassment, right? But this is part of why I think having these discussions about harassment openly and with as many people as possible, not just with the converted that willingly show up for these meetings, but having leadership that enforces that this is important and everybody should be part of it is such a critical aspect of it. I think otherwise we can't get people to understand where the limits are, where the line gets crossed before they can even become active bystanders that would help people. Yep.
I also just wanted to add a brief point about this question related to allyship and how to include other groups of people in these conversations. So based on both the film and some of the discussions we've been having today, we are really focused on two aspects of discrimination and harassment, sexism based on gender and racism. And I think I just want to highlight the point that there are so many other type of intersectional groups and experiences that define a person's identity that need to be addressed and that need to have more data generated about. So for example, when talking about the perceptions of female scientists or differences between men and women in the workplace, I think we need to generate similar data sets or understandings of how people of different intersectional identities related to, their gender identity or their sexual orientation, their ability, their socioeconomic status, their cultural background, their age. Like, these are all other factors that need to be considered in this discussion about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and harassment and discrimination in academia.
Thank you for that point. I'm not sure if we have more time because we are at the hour. I just want to confirm with Kate.
I would just say, I think we've reached the our hour mark, and I mean, there's so much to talk about in this film. There's so much to talk about when thinking about these issues. But I would just love to thank all our contributors today for, starting the wheels rolling, and for all the work that all of you have done over the course of your careers and will continue to do. It's really astounding. And I think I said this maybe before we were on air, but when I was putting together this Picture a STEMinist series and doing the research for it and looking for women who would maybe participate, it was such a joy and a pleasure. And these are dark times, but it gave me hope learning about all of you, learning about your work. And I think it's just wonderful. So I'd like to thank you all very much. Thank you for your participation. Thank you, Yonna, for moderating. And thank you to Annie and Doug behind the scenes for making everything run smoothly. And thanks to our participants for your questions and showing up to participate in this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.